Who controls the world?
Well, I did a master's thesis back in 1991, Zane, and it was when the U.S. was planning the Gulf War, and it was called A Political Economy of Middle East Oil, the GCC, a Regional Resource Security System for the Regime of International Capital Accumulation. One of those big, long academic, titles. It was a 144-page thesis. I wanted to find out who owned the oil companies that were involved in the Middle East, and everybody knew Iraq was about oil. So I went on the Compact Disclosure, which is a research tool that used to exist. It was on CD-ROM back in the days when, everything was on those CD-ROMs. And it allowed you to find out the shareholders of all the publicly listed companies in the Fortune 500. And so I researched it, found out, and it turns out all these big oil companies, what I call the Four Horsemen, which is ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP Amoco, and Chevron Texaco, were owned by the same banks. So then I thought, well, we better find out who owns the banks, because whoever owns the banks actually owns the oil companies. So then I sent letters to the Treasury Department, the Comptroller of Currency, the Federal Reserve, and I got all these letters back, and they were classified under Freedom of Information Act requests, and I was denied access to the information on the bank holding company ownership based on national security. So I completed the thesis and 144 pages, and I just graduated. I kept going, and I studied another 15 years, really. Traveled to 50 countries, read a lot of newspapers, read over 100 books on the subject. And I came to the conclusion that these bank holding companies are owned by 8 families that own 52% of our New York Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the private banking cartel that issues currency that's not really a U.S. dollar, it's a Federal Reserve note. So the New York Fed is the only bank that really matters. And these 8 families actually have 52% ownership. And those 8 families are Rothschild, Rockefeller, Goldman Sachs, Kuhn Loeb, Warburg, Lazard, Israel, Moses, Saif, and Lehman, which is now kind of merged with the Oppenheimer family interests. And there are other families, of course, who are prominent, but these are the main families.
Dean, what is the brief history of these families and their background?
Yeah, well, my research has these families. You can trace their lineage actually all the way back to Sumeria. The Sumerian clay tablets, which have been unearthed along the Tigris and Euphrates River Delta down by Basra in Iraq. At first, they were just taken as these metaphors and this kind of crazy talk by the Sumerians, but Zecharia Sitchin came along and he began to translate these literally. And they told about these Anunnaki who came to Earth and occupied them and herded them into agriculture and began the cities of Ur and Babylon. And apparently some of these bloodlines from these families were part of this. They then moved to Egypt, sort of usurped the pyramids from the Moors who probably built them. The Sphinx, for example, was already there. They topped them off. These were probably free energy devices, actually, that people before were using. They went on then to the city of London, but before that, they stopped at the Roman Empire, and they were run out by the Moors out of Egypt. Before they did, they started the Grand Lodge of Cairo and stuff. They fled to Spain, battled with the Moors again, ran them out, started the slave trade, eventually found their way to London. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire was financing the Knights Templar, the Knights of St. John, and these different crusaders who really started the concept of banking. When they had the fleets of ships, they charged pilgrims to the Middle East, Holy Land, exorbitant fees to go there, got them in debt, created the whole concept of credit, really. Up until that time, even the Christians banned usury. So they started the banking system. Then they went around the world and they pilfered indigenous cultures, all the gold, the diamonds, the treasures, along with all of their spiritual knowledge of reality. And they used that wealth to build up the Roman Empire. And they became known as the Black Nobility. And these were the Genoese and Phoenician bankers from the old days. Well, so these Sephardic Jews that moved into London then intermarried with what they call the crown. And this whole entity is really known as the crown now. And that's the Black nobility, and along with the Sephardic Jews who began their careers as Hafjuden court Jews to the crown. But they ended up financing the crowns. When they got into debt, they did get into debt. And so these families that I just named are actually more wealthy even than the black nobility now, but they are also very wealthy.
Dean, how are these families able to control the web of power you just mentioned and described?
Well, the primary mechanism is the notion of private central banking. Again, our entire history as humankind, the Sumerian tablets talk about how they were forced into agriculture. Before that, we were all hunter and gatherers. There was no class system. There was certainly no bankers. But what happens when you go into agriculture, one farmer has a good crop, the other has a bad crop. So he borrows some wheat from the other farmer. Thus begins the rise of this banker relationship to the masses. They used Babylon and Ur as the testing grounds for this because the Sumerians were feeding these cities. And so they realized that if they could become the owners of the banks, that they could do pretty well. And of course, they had this money starting a long time ago, so it's built up over the years. And this private banking system works with this fiat currency, where they're allowed to issue 10 times what they actually have on deposit. And so they basically loan out money, get countries, entire nations, entire regions, individuals in debt. And then they use the money that comes in and they lend it out again at 10 times. And so it's just, they've learned that this issuing pretty much money out of nothing. And not only that, but they have, for example, in the United States with the Federal Reserve private banking cartel, the Treasury and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing even pay for the paper and the coinage. So they don't even pay for that. They just literally get this free right to issue money into the ether, and then building up the debt is how they keep control over the whole thing. The United States has a $24 trillion debt at this point. And a lot of people think it's to the Chinese or Japanese or the Saudis, the Kuwaitis. And some of it is, maybe $1 billion each, right? But most of that 24 billion, let's say about 20 trillion of it is actually owed to these banking families. And they've done that to every country in the world. And they've by doing that, they can then impose austerity measures. And most of these austerity measures involve the handing over of real assets based on this phony debt, like land, like industries. Example, Mexico 1995 debt crisis. The way that debt equity swap worked was the bankers forgave the debt, negotiated by JP Morgan Chase, the whole thing, which is a Rockefeller bank. And then we go in and get the cement company. We go in and get the railroad. The entire railroad of the state of Mexico, which is state-owned, is now privatized and owned by Burlington Northern Santa Fe, which is owned by Warren Buffett and these same people. And so they learned that the central bank, if they could control all the central banks, they could control the world. Rothschild himself, Myron Amstel Rothschild said, I care not who controls the country so long as I control its currency. And that's the other thing they do is they manipulate the value of currencies according to what they need and from where. And so it's interesting, for example, the British pound is worth more than the US dollar. The Kuwaiti dinar is worth more than the US dollar, even though, for example, Britain really has not many natural resources left. They've used them all up.